Happy New Year and welcome to the first episode of A Slice of Medieval for 2026. Today, Derek and I are going to chat about Britain after the Romans left. Now, as you may know, Derek wrote a series a few years ago called The Last of the Romans. Fabulous books based on the story of Ambrosius Aurelianus and post-Roman Britain. Now, luckily, and I hope I'm not giving away a secret, in 2026, Derek is publishing a new novel to continue the series, which I'm really excited about. So Derek's been deep in post-Roman Britain, which means we thought I might be able to persuade Derek to talk about post-Roman Britain. Now, I don't know an awful lot, so he's going to have to carry most of this episode. Sorry, Derek.
Heavy lifting, my speciality.
So let's get on with the first question before I tie my tongue in any more knots. Derek, Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries is often seen as a dark age about which we can know nothing for certain. Is it really? What evidence do we have for this period?
Yeah, I think it's always traditionally been regarded as part of the Dark Age, which always kind of meant an age for which there were very few written sources and therefore not much description of what happened. And if there wasn't any written description of what happened, it tended to be thought that therefore we couldn't know anything about it. To an extent, that's obviously true. We do have some written sources. In some ways, the problem is that we have one major near contemporary source for Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries, and really only one. Often it's helpful if you've got two or three, even if they're not perfect, because you can kind of cross-reference a bit. But the main source is written by a monk called Gildas. He was writing probably, we think, around the first half, sometime in the first half of the 6th century. Now, as I said, Gildas was a monk, but he wasn't writing a history. He's actually writing a condemnation of the Britons in the 6th century for not being as effective as they were in the late 5th century, as their forefathers were. So his work, which in English is called On the Ruin of Britain, De Excidio et Questu Britanniae, which is why everybody calls it On the Ruin of Britain, it's a complaint, basically. And he's probably not writing in Britain. He's probably in Gaul. Nobody can be certain about either of those things. But he's basically saying, you guys have got to do better. You've got to do better. Your country's falling apart and you're not doing anything to stop disorder and so on and so forth. Anyway, so he's the main written source for this period in Britain. Now, as well as that, we've got a few contemporary or near contemporary Welsh poems. Now, when you say poems, people think, oh, well, how does that help historically? But these poems were often recording events, possibly exaggerating events, but they were recording events, perhaps, and the exploits of individuals at a time when, as I said, we've got very little other written evidence. So they have a value. There are also genealogies of the time which record names of people who may or may not have existed, but if you can cross-reference their existence with some other piece of, even perhaps a tiny piece of evidence, a reference, then you can say, well, okay, that person was mentioned in the poem or in the genealogy, and we've got this other mention of him in a completely different place. So there's a good chance that person did actually exist, and maybe what the poem says about them may have some grain of truth in it. So you've got those sort of indirect sources. But the next source, well, I say the next source, the next surviving source is not until the 8th century, when you've got the Venerable Bede, another monk, who wrote an account of the history of the English people, but it was really an ecclesiastical account. So its focus was on religious milestones and so on. Bede used Gildas and other sources, original sources we no longer have. So there may be things in Bede which aren't in Gildas, which aren't anywhere else. So it's always difficult to know, is this hearsay that he's recorded? Is it from a reliable source? We don't know. So it's limited.
This is the written evidence we have that have survived.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily the only stuff that was written down at the time. I mean, we know there will have been a lot fewer written records because of the number of people who could read and write in those days. But it's like the burning of the Library of Alexandria, isn't it? It's what we've lost, and we don't even know what we've lost.
Yeah. This is true. And when you get in the 9th century, you get the history of the Britons, which is attributed to another monk called Nennius, but in reality, it's probably a collection of writings from probably different authors and with different areas of reliability. So up to the 9th century, more or less, all your major sources are written by monks. Monks who may or may not have been aware of the actual events that took place. I mean, the only one who has any chance of being reliably informed about events at the time in the late 5th century is Gildas. None of the others are direct sources. They're not contemporary sources. So it's all for them. They're reading what's been recorded and they're synthesizing that and putting their own spin on it and so on. And then finally, we've got the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is not contemporary at all for the 5th century. It's written centuries later. And again, it records certain events about kings, about the weather and church.
A lot about the weather. An awful lot about the weather.
So, I mean, that in the first, we're talking about writing about the 5th century, and I'm already up to sort of 8th, 9th, 10th centuries. And then in the 12th century, you get Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, which is 90% fiction, because Geoffrey was very good at making things up. But again, the tantalizing thing is probably the other 10%. In there somewhere, there may well be what Geoffrey's discovered from actual sources that, again, no longer exist. And that is it, really. That is all the written evidence that we have. And hence, people have called it the Dark Ages, because we don't have that wealth of written evidence. But what's changed in the last 20, 30 years is archaeology and the appliance of science to archaeology. So now we know more, we know a lot more from archaeology about the lives, let's say, of the people as a whole who lived in the 5th and 6th centuries. Things we didn't know 50 years ago, we know now. And things we thought we knew 50 years ago have been re-evaluated in the light of recent archaeological evidence. You might think, well, we're talking about the 5th century, surely the amount of knowledge we have is finite, it's done, it's dusted, that's it. But it's not. It's continually being added to. And that process takes longer than people think, because archaeological digs take a while, they can take years or months. But also the findings from those digs sometimes take years, literally years, to reach the light of day, because it's so time consuming.
People have to work out what things are. I don't know if you've seen it on recent news reports and things, but there's this dodecahedron that they found at Newton Disney in Lincolnshire. And there's umpteen ideas of what it was for, from, a child's toy to an ornament. So it's one of those things you're not going to work it out straight away unless you find something and go, that's a pencil because it looks much like a
Yeah,
pencil does today.
yeah,
There's scientific testing to be done and things like that, isn't there? And it might just be that it sits on top of a pole or something and it's, it's a headpiece for a staff.
yeah,
But
yeah,
it's working these things out and reevaluating as well, because they're not always just because somebody says it's one thing, somebody 10 years later might say, actually, that's not that, it's something else.
yeah. And people may say, well, how can archaeology tell us about the events? Well, they rarely can. But what they can do is give us a perspective which the written sources may not give us. One small example, archaeology can now tell us that there are Saxon settlements alongside British settlements in
Mm,
certain areas, something we were totally unaware of or might have suspected but didn't know. Archaeology now can confirm that. And what that means is that our understanding of how the Saxons and Britons interacted has to change. So we have to factor in, well, okay, maybe, one didn't wipe out the other or whatever. Maybe they lived side by side for a while, who knows? But it's a new piece of information. So
mm,
yes, it's dark ages in the sense we don't have much written information, but we do have an increasing amount of archaeological data. If you think about what people did at the time, only in terms of battles that were fought, you'd think they'd be fighting all the time, there'd be nobody left.
mm,
But of course, they were people, and they had many similarities with a modern day person in that they like to have fun, they like to sometimes just sit and do very little, they like to engage in activities that weren't the ones that are recorded in the chronicles.
mm.
So, probably 99% of their lives doesn't appear in any chronicle. But yet that's most of their time on
Yeah,
the planet.
yeah,
So that's how little we know about what they were up to. So archaeology plays a big part in telling us, well, actually, yeah, they were using dice, they were gambling or whatever.
mm,
It was a pastime that they did. And we're feeding on scraps to some extent, but the more you have, the more archaeology there that is done in more areas of Britain, the clearer
mm.
picture you have.
And it's funny because it is the domestic side that you're finding out more of with archaeology, because finding
Yeah,
a battlefield from the fifth or sixth century is going to be impossible, isn't it? They talk about, what is it, the Battle of Badon, that was King Arthur's greatest battle, but nobody knows where it is, and you're never actually going to be able to find it, because what's going to be left on a battlefield unless you find mass graves? And
the thing about battles is that in the period we're talking about, and TV and film don't help this much, but the numbers fighting are
mm,
relatively small. There weren't thousands of warriors in this period. We tend to think of them in thousands, hundreds, perhaps at the most, at any one point in time. There just weren't that many people to
mm,
to be fighting. Most people weren't fighters. If they were called up to fight, or if they were encouraged to fight by their war leaders, then they were poorly armed. They wouldn't have a
yeah,
sword. A spear was your best bet, really, an axe or a spear, because those were things.
or a hoe that they were using for the field.
Well, yeah, yeah, yeah. So we have to not get too carried away with the idea that life was about
Mm.
fighting, really, because it never has been, and it probably never will be.
So why did Rome abandon control of Britain in the 5th century? Because it just went all the way up to Hadrian's Wall and beyond, and then suddenly they pulled out. Was it a sudden thing, or was it an over time thing, and we just see it as sudden now?
Well, personally, I've never seen it as sudden. It's always amused me. It continues to amuse me when people talk about the Romans leaving in 410 AD, which is ridiculous anyway. You can't do that in
Yeah, I've
one
just got this
year.
image of them all getting on a boat at Dover, everybody just filing down to Dover. Yeah.
Yeah, will the last one out switch off the light, sort of thing. Yeah, that really is a nonsense, and it's born really of the image that early historians had, that there had to be an
Mm,
end point to more or less
yes.
everything, and the
Yeah.
nice idea of having dates to to manage chunks of time. If you say, well, from 410 AD, it's chaos. Romans have gone. The story really lies in the 3rd and 4th centuries, as you might imagine, because it's a linear progress. It's not a sudden chop end of Roman Britain, and then all these sort of Romano Britons are left defenseless and so on. In the 3rd century, you have examples of ambitious men using the military resources of Britain for their own ends, and setting themselves up as sort of Roman rulers of Britain, if you like, or rulers of Roman Britain, but also with ambitions sometimes beyond Britain. And that destabilizes things a little bit in the 3rd century. But then in the 4th century, you have real problems. Britain is under real threat in the 4th century. And it all comes to a head in the year 367 AD. 367 is the sort of the terrible year of Roman occupation of Britain, because there is a concerted attack on Britain by the 3 major destabilizing forces. That's the Picts north of the wall, north of Hadrian's Wall, the Scots, who, contrary to popular belief, come from Ireland, who are raiding the west and south coasts for plunder and slaves and so on, and the Saxons, who are raiding the south and east coasts for booty and slaves and so on. Saxons is a generic term which includes a multitude of people, as we'll see. But basically, in 367, these 3 separate groups appear to have combined, to have organized to make a concerted attack. And Britain is, the large parts of southern Britain particularly, are very, very severely affected by this. And what it does, the Romans obviously don't defend Britain that well in 367, because everybody's taken by surprise. And many of the British people are saying to themselves, well, hang on a minute, Rome is our protector. We pay taxes to Rome. We expect, therefore, in return, that Rome is at least going to keep us vaguely alive and protect our trade and all the rest of it. But 367 is the year when people begin to doubt or have their doubts confirmed about what Rome can actually do. It's a kind of a wake-up call for ordinary people, and not just ordinary people, but people who have authority locally, who say to themselves, well, what do we do about this? If Rome can't protect us, how are we to protect ourselves? Now, a lot of people talk about the Britons after Rome leave, but the important thing to talk about is the Britons before Rome has left. In that last 50 to 60 years of the 4th century and early 5th century, that's when the changes are happening. And what's happening is that the Britons are being armed. They are arming themselves. So the concept of Britain being defenseless when the Romans leave is not true, because we know from archaeological data that the British tribes, this is something I find endlessly fascinating, so stop me if I go on about it too much, but the tribes of Britain, the tribal divisions of Britain, when the Romans came in 43 AD, are basically still much the same when they leave 400 years later. And when they start to think about arming themselves, protecting themselves, it is in those tribal areas that they tend to identify as centers of military power and organization. So that is not a sort of snap your fingers event. That's a long process in which people's attitudes gradually change. Because if you think about it, people's attitudes don't change on a dime, as it were. They change over a bit of time. So you have this cataclysmic event in 367 AD. Then you have a generation of people thinking, well, what the heck do we do about this? And then you have another generation of people thinking, well, actually, what we need to do is this. So by the time the Romans actually go, there is some basic militia, some basic organization in Britain, kind of ready, not maybe step up is a too big a word to use, but it's there. It kind of exists. It's patchy. It's not going to be the same in all areas. But also the other thing at the beginning of the 5th century that happens is that one of the people in Britain, a Roman soldier called Constantine, is proclaimed emperor, Constantine III, and he takes virtually all the Roman military forces from Britain in 407. He takes them to Gaul to press his claim as emperor, and he's actually recognized as co-emperor in the West in 409, I think, and he remains co-emperor for a couple of years before he meets an untimely end. But it's highly likely that most of the Roman forces he took with him, or Romano-British forces, or whoever he took with him, a lot of them either perished with him when he was killed, or they remained where they were and didn't travel all the way back to Britain. So what I'm saying is the Romans didn't so much leave Britain as this individual established himself as a co-emperor and took British resources and Roman resources in Britain to do it. And after him, there are no substantial military forces. There almost certainly was a force along the wall in the north, but it would have been a very stripped down force. And any other Roman units that remained in Britain would have been small. Almost certainly they would have been auxiliary forces from various parts of the remaining empire. The Romans also had a habit of using what they call foederati, which are men from other tribal groups in Europe who they pay to act as mercenaries to help defend, in this case, Britain. So some of those may well have been left. Guess where some of those come from? Some of those are Saxons.
Right.
So early on in the 5th century, it is not so much that Rome has abandoned Britain. No, there are reasons they might. You're left with a Britain which is not quite as broken and as vacant and as defenseless as we're led to believe. But there are other pressures on Rome to make them abandon Britain. If you've got attacks on Rome itself, you've got pressure all around the borders of the empire. You've got bits of the empire already seceding, and so Rome's got its problems.
But it also, by this point, it wasn't Rome either, was it? The emperor was in Constantinople. The emperors had abandoned Rome.
Yeah, I mean, the empire hadn't, I don't think, officially split, but in practice it had split. So you had a Western emperor. So when, for example, Constantine III claims the imperial throne, he's not claiming the imperial throne of the whole of the empire. He's claiming the imperial throne of the Western Empire. And Honorius, who is the existing emperor in the West in Rome, he is the one he's co-emperor with, or allows him to be co-emperor. But they're co-emperors of the Western Empire, not the whole Roman Empire. But yeah, there are pressures on Rome, but there are specific things about Britain that meant it was hard to carry on controlling it because of this disruption in the 4th century and the feeling in Britain itself. We're not talking about the Britons versus the Romans. We're talking about individual magistrates and soldiers and officials who are also thinking, well, we want to be defended as well. And Rome isn't really able to do it. So between us, we've got to work together to see how we can have some kind of effective defense.
So we also have this view that Britain during the time of Rome had lovely straight roads, a proper legal system, white marble villas everywhere with the most gorgeous mosaics, and this great wall in the north called Hadrian's Wall, that as soon as the Romans left, everybody stole the stones from Hadrian's Wall. Everybody moved out of the Roman villas. And of course, the roads have never been right since. Is that it? What was Britain like after Rome pulled out?
Well, the villas one is interesting because opinion on that has changed in the last decade or so, again with archaeology, because all the evidence until recent times suggested that the villas were kind of at their peak in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and that by the 4th century, second half of the 4th century, the use of villas was in decline. And the evidence, I mean, I've worked on a Roman dig for a long time at a villa, and that was certainly the impression we got. The last coins we found were in the mid 4th century, suggesting that occupation ended at that point, or was more sporadic at least. But of late, we've actually discovered villas. When I say we, not me personally, but archaeologists have discovered villas that were either built in the 5th century or late 4th century, or were renovated and expanded in that time, which kind of changes the narrative a bit, because it suggests that, well, maybe villas weren't totally finished. Probably a family continued to occupy a villa as long as it was economically viable to do so. So when we talk about the decline of villas, we're really talking about the decline of the rural economy and changes in the rural economy. And if you factor that in to 367 AD, is it a coincidence that certainly many villas seem not to be occupied or regularly occupied after the middle of the 4th century, and lo and behold, we have this cataclysmic event? And are the two in any way connected? And I would suggest they are, not specifically connected to individual villas, but I think the idea that maybe if you live in an isolated villa, you have very poor means of defense against raids. Maybe there's a better way. Maybe you should move to a town, or maybe you should not be in the countryside all the time. Maybe you should be in the village type.
Or find a big hill.
Yeah. So I think what it means is this general idea of people were having to re-examine how they did things in the light of changing circumstances. Again, we like to think Roman Britain, one period, 400 years, it was all the same all the time that existed. But of course it wasn't. And it is hundreds of years. Change was happening all the time. So when we get to the 5th century, the Britain we're talking about is nothing like Britain, let's say, at the beginning of the 4th century. Things have changed, attitudes have changed. It's not, therefore, someone turning off the light. It's not a question of there being a wonderful Roman civilization one minute and chaos the next. Initially, I imagine there was probably very little change at all. Local magistrates would be operating on much the same basis as they had in previous decades. What there probably would have been, what would have been noticeable to somebody at the time, was maybe disruption of trade a bit, decline in trade perhaps, people not trading with Britain, perhaps if they felt that, for example, the waterways, the channel and so on were more dangerous, with Saxon pirates being more numerous, things like that. We know that there were people who preyed on shipping. Now, without any sort of Roman fleet to protect them, maybe that got worse. So we'd expect maybe, therefore, some shortages of goods because trade was disrupted. And also we'd think that there would be a decline in living standards. There was less wealth, there was less money changing hands with trade and income from rural estates around a villa. So the economy would have changed, would have been changing. And like most times when the economy is changing, as today, we feel the effects of certain changes. We don't notice certain other changes because it doesn't affect us individually, but that doesn't mean that change isn't happening gradually in the background. So, I mean, I think it was a changing society, but that change had begun not when the Romans switched off the light at the beginning of the century, but it had begun in the century before. What we're talking about is a Britain that gradually begins to fragment around its old tribal boundaries, which I find amazing because it's hundreds of years since those tribes actually had power. But when you peel back the layers a bit, what you realize is that some parts of Britain were never really particularly Romanized. The southwest, for example, and the west were never that Romanized. Even places like Wiltshire and Hampshire and Buckinghamshire and Berkshire in the centre, and and a bit further north in the West Midlands, those areas were not massively Romanized. Yes, they had Roman towns, and yes, they had Roman roads, and yes, they had Roman practices and Roman customs and so on. But the people who actually lived there, who farmed the land, would probably not have seen themselves as Romans. Now, in the East, it's completely different. That is much more Romanized. We need to think of Britain not as one unitary place, but areas which behaved differently according, as time went on, according to what had happened previously in those areas. So you get the sort of the beginnings of militia, we said, in the 4th century, local militia, tribal militia, and that tribal identity becomes massively important in the 5th century because Rome's gone. The natural authority of Rome is no longer there. So you have magistrates still, you have people who are in control. You always have people who have wealth and power. So those are the guys who are going to be the movers and shakers no matter what. But who are they? They're probably increasingly not particularly Romanized families that are controlling things. For example, if you start to look at some of the areas of Britain which particularly had to look to their defense, if you look to the southwest, regularly threatened by the Scots, coming over in small boats and nicking things basically and creating havoc. All along the southwest coast and the southwest peninsula of Britain, those areas which had never been really Romanized were now having to really control their defense and control what was going on, or they would be eliminated, they'd be destroyed. So you can see why there was more of a threat for them to deal with. The tribes like the Durotriges who were in Dorset, the Dumnonii who were in Devon and Cornwall, and so on and so forth. These tribal identities were beginning to come to the fore in the early parts of the middle of the 5th century. And it's not something that you read about in history books.
No, and I've just realised that there is these different perceptions, isn't there? The Romans are perceived as an occupying force.
Yes.
Whereas the Anglo-Saxons are perceived as an integrating force. You know, they both invaded, but the Anglo-Saxons came.
Well, did they?
Well, they moved in, and there probably was some fighting. There was probably a combination of invasion and living together, but they integrated. Whereas you don't get the sense that the Romans ever tried to integrate, rather than they just tried to control.
Yeah, I think I'd argue that in some respects the two things are the same, but for different reasons. That if you're a Roman, and particularly if you're in Rome, you see the Roman way of life as the ideal form of existence, and you bestow that in the form of Roman citizenship on all and sundry who you want to reward and who do you stuff like fighting for you and so on. If you're a Briton under Roman control, you have an ambivalent attitude towards Rome. Rome provides things for you, but you have to pay taxes to Rome. You know, and whenever people are paying taxes to anybody for anything, what do? They complain. They say, well, you know, we're paying these taxes. We're not, what are we getting in return? That people could have said that from the year, as soon as taxes were invented up until now, and including now, people will say, well, we're paying these taxes. What are we getting for it? And you reach a tipping point where you think, yeah, okay, so paying the taxes is not an option anymore because it doesn't get us anything. What we need to do is put our resources into local defense. Now, that desire for local defense could be caused by the Picts in the north, it could be caused by the Scots in the south and the west, it could be caused by the Saxons in the south and the east, it could be caused by any threat. But what we need to get away from is that the only problems were external, because it's becoming clearer now that the biggest threat was actually in Britain. It wasn't the external forces.
So that's the question then. So what problems did Britain face in the 5th century? The Romans have left, technically.
Yeah, I think we should not mention that ever again. Romans have left. The people who were living there and had jobs to do were still there. They were Romano-Britons. They could have been from anywhere in the empire as well, because again, there's some kind of entity called Romans, which doesn't exist in the fourth, well, any of the centuries really, because they're a hodgepodge of people from all over the empire. Some people would have stayed in Britain anyway, because they'd settled there almost, their families were there, they defended the wall for years. And why would they go anywhere else? They wouldn't be going back to Rome. So really a lot of the military power of Rome was in its auxilia. Cavalry was particularly important because they were mobile and they could cover a bigger area. The people who ruled, the people who controlled, the people who defended Roman Britain in the 5th century were from all over the place, but they would have seen Britain, I think most of them would have seen Britain as their home. There would be people who it was a career move to go and be an official or wherever, somewhere in the empire, and they would have been posted to Britain. But by the 5th century, if you're in Britain, you're probably staying there unless you've got some strong reason to go to Gaul, maybe you've got relatives there or wherever. So it's a society that I don't think we really recognise clearly enough because of the difficulties of not having the written sources for so long. So what are the problems that Britain faces? Well, there's the ongoing incursions by the three groups I've mentioned. And let's just talk about Saxons for a minute. Historians have bandied the word Saxon about for so long, but Saxon is not a one single group of people from a particular place. It's a term which is applied to virtually anybody, Frisians, Jutes, etc., who come to Britain. And so we mustn't assume, whilst they have a cultural identity in terms of their pagan religion and so on, we mustn't assume they're kind of all members of the same club, in that, he's a Saxon, therefore he's my friend because I'm a Saxon, and that's a Briton, so he's not my friend. It's nonsense, because one group of Saxons could equally be the enemy of another group of Saxons as much as they could be the enemy of a group of Britons as a settlement of Britons. It's not as if there's some great plan that says they're all going to do the same thing and all going to be on the same side, because they're competing with the Britons to some extent for land. You've got Saxons in Britain. You've had Saxons in Britain for several generations. The Romans had federati, as I said. They had Saxons and others helping to defend the coastlines and the wall and so on. So they've been settled there for years. Why, if you're a Saxon, would you want to be a mercenary for Rome? You'd want to be a mercenary for Rome because they're going to pay you, or in lieu of pay, give you some land. Now, it's very easy for Rome to say, well, when you've served as a mercenary for X number of years, you can have a plot of land to settle on. And this was an attractive proposition. That's fine as long as the Romans actually give you that land. But if you think about the beginning of the 5th century, deals that Rome made with Saxon mercenaries might well be a bit in abeyance, because Roman control was crumbling a little bit in terms of organization and law and order and so on. So what we find is that you have a lot of mercenaries, both Saxon and other nationalities, in Britain who are not given land, or are given very poor land that nobody else wants, and they're very disgruntled. There would also be some who weren't disgruntled, but if you're a Saxon, if you're a mercenary, you're not going to go home. You're not going to earn lots of money and then go home. You're basically still making your life in Britain. They've not come to Britain so then go back there with a shed load of money. They're not Vikings. They're not going a Viking. They're not going raiding and coming back home with loads of silver. They're not in that ballpark at all. They've come to Britain to settle there, to help defend it, to make a living in the first instance, I suppose. What we find in the 5th century is that the Roman authority may be gradually being eroded, but somebody still has to defend Britain. So the British, or Romano-British, call them what you like, officials and magistrates and so on, continue to employ Saxons as mercenaries. Now, how do we know this? Well, archaeology tells us there's quite a large Saxon settlement in the Thames Valley, Upper Thames Valley particularly. Well, there ain't no Picts and Scots in the Upper Thames Valley. So who are they defending against in the Upper Thames Valley? You know, if you're the Catabalorni tribe or you're the Atrebates tribe based around Silchester and you hire Saxon mercenaries, who are they going to fight? Who are your enemies? You're in the middle of the country. The Scots aren't going to leave too far from the coast. The Picts are miles north, and they're Saxons. So are they defending against other Saxons? But there are no Saxons in attacking the Upper Thames Valley. So why are they there? Why are they employed? And increasingly, what becomes obvious is that Britain is fragmenting along tribal lines. And these tribes have an identity, and part of that identity is they really don't like the tribe next to them. They didn't like them before 43 AD, and they don't like them anymore now. It's very parochial. And in the 5th century, we're seeing fortifications being built, like Wansdyke. Wansdyke is the boundary between tribes. It's not a defense against Saxons. You wouldn't build it there. Basically,
No,
you certainly wouldn't build it there at that time because the Saxons weren't numerous in that area at that time. So you wouldn't feel, well, we've got to build a big defensive wall to keep them out. However, you might build a defensive wall to keep the Debunny out, or the Coritani out, or the Atrebates out, or whatever. So what we're increasingly finding, remember what I was saying about the increasing tribal identity of militias, and we know this because the insignia, the horse brasses and things like this that you find in archaeology, you can identify the tribe that they were associated with, and you know they're different from one area to another, and you know that therefore there were different identities growing up within what we would think of as post-Roman Britain. The only explanation that makes sense as to why British society fragments and sort of destroys itself almost in the 5th century is not that there were massive numbers of Saxons coming in, because we know there weren't massive numbers. We know there were limited numbers of Saxons settling. There's absolutely no evidence for the 5th century that there were, until the very end anyway, or to near the end, that there were large numbers of Saxons landing on the coasts of Britain and working their way inland. They may have landed on the coast, as Saxon pirates might have done, and they might have decided to settle there and chuck the inhabitants of that bit out. But there's no, in the 5th century, we're not seeing any massive numbers of Saxons fighting Britons. What we are seeing is Britons fighting Britons. So it's a fragmentation of society that's taking place, not a simple story of invading Saxons, wiping out the Britons, driving them to the west, which is, how it used to be seen. There's a lot we don't know, basically. But gradually a picture is emerging of a very unstable country. And there's limited political knowledge about that country that we have. And that's the thing. I mean, I remember in one of the books I wrote, fiction books, obviously, about Ambrosius Aurelianus, though he is a real character. Somebody wrote, well, I enjoyed the book, but I would have liked more about the political events of the time. And I replied, well, so would I.
So would you.
Because we just don't know. We just don't know. And the amount we don't know is huge. The sources tell us, for example, about this leader of the Britons called Vortigern. He's often mentioned. It's said that he was the high king of Britain in the sort of middle of the 5th century, which suggests by then there were lots, as we've said, lots of different fragmented bits of Britain fending for themselves, but also maybe now and again one of them exerts dominance over the others. Pretty natural thing to happen in history, really. You'd be surprised if it didn't. Some of these tribes would be more powerful than others. So Vortigern apparently makes himself High King. Well, that all sounds very straightforward, doesn't it? Except we don't even know whether Vortigern was his name or whether Vortigern was his title. We, we don't actually know much about the guy at all. We have a lot of we have some I say a lot. We have some Welsh annals which refer to him, but of course they call him something different because in the Welsh annals everybody's called something different. Ambrosius Aurelianus is called something different. So you have to try and piece together who they're talking about. Yeah, it's an unstable society, and if there is somebody called Vortigern, not entirely convinced there ever was, but if there was, then when he falls, there is the beginnings of some chaos.
But wasn't he killed by Hengist and Horsa or something?
I don't personally believe Hengist and Horsa even existed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle talks about them. There are other sources that I mean, two brothers. It's a trope, isn't it? I mean, two brothers founded Rome. Two brothers came to
Yeah, it's
England.
always two brothers.
It's always two brothers, or maybe sometimes three. But I just don't believe that anybody writing later on had the remotest idea either whether there were two brothers, what they were called, or anything else. I think it's very much a case of the later sources trying to make sense, quite laudably, trying to make sense of what little they knew. So I don't put a great deal of store by Hengist and Horsa and all this. It's stories, really. It's just stories. Funnily enough, the stories have marriages and rapes and violence. Now, looking at films and TV today, it seems to me that the things doing best, the most popular things, have violence and rapes and stormy marriages. And 'twas ever thus, I would suggest, that if you want to get your audience's attention, as chroniclers do,
Yeah,
you make stuff up that's exciting.
that's true, actually. Yeah, nobody's going to buy the book that says they just ploughed the fields all day, every day.
Yeah, exactly. They were jolly good
And they had a
plowmen.
drink at the end of the day, and then they went out the next day and ploughed the fields again.
Read on to find out what they did in the evening when there was no light.
So, how was it then that by the end of the 6th century, much of Britain came to be controlled by English or Saxon rulers?
Well, this is very much the $64,000 question, really. And the traditional view is that it was successive waves of Saxon invaders pushing the Britons back, exterminating. It was kind of ethnic cleansing that took place. And this made sense of the fact that a lot of the place names were basically English names or Saxon names. There weren't many British place names. It made sense of the fact that it was very swift, or appears to be very swift, that the Saxon control of most of mainland Britain, south of the wall, most of mainland Britain was relatively fast. So surely it must have happened by conquest. There's no other reasonable explanation. And that's what they were thinking for a long time. That was the view that was held, that the native Britons were savagely swept aside by fire and sword, and that's how it happened. But I don't think it can have done. I don't think it's possible that it happened in that way. So here's what we know, or here's what we can put together with reasonable confidence. Britain fragmented along tribal lines during the 5th century, over a long period of time, perhaps. What most societies do is they keep what they like and they dispense with what they don't like. So they don't like paying taxes to Rome, so that's not going to happen. But somebody needs money to run the country, to run a bit of it, a tribal area. So you probably make your taxes to a local leader. And what we find is that by the middle of the 5th century, there is not chaos in Britain, but Britain is a rather different place. I mean, we've got a bit of evidence. For example, in 446, Bishop Germanus visits Britain. Now, he's not going to visit Britain if it's being torn apart by Saxons. not unless he's got a bit of a death wish. He goes to St Albans, the old Roman Verulamium, which is in the east, and you'd expect, therefore, if this is waves of Saxon invaders are trashing Britain and exterminating the inhabitants, you'd expect that by 446 AD, he's going to get to St Albans and find nobody there. They're all dead. They're only Saxons there. Well, but that isn't the case. It appears to be still fairly Roman, fairly Romano-British in Verulamium at that time. But there were definitely Saxons there because he refers to Saxons being there. So you've got evidence that it's not absolute chaos at that point in the middle of the century. Okay, so we assume that things escalate during the second half of the century. So what happens then? Well, Gildas, our only contemporary written source, says that there was conflict between Saxons and Britons. So that's where all this original idea of the ethnic cleansing or whatever comes from our one source. And over the years, opinion about Gildas changes sort of with the weather. Originally, Gildas was gold standard. This is what happened, exactly as he tells us. Then people began to question it and say, well, how do we know that? And they began to move away from Gildas and say, well, he wasn't really there. He was adjacent, but maybe he didn't know as much as we think, and he wasn't writing history. So maybe we need to take Gildas with a pinch of salt. But interestingly, as our archaeology has built up over the last few decades, people are coming to say, well, actually, this sounds very much like what Gildas was talking about. So Gildas talks about the Britons resisting the Saxons in the second half of the 5th century. And he talks about Ambrosius Aurelianus being a kind of war leader, not a king as such, though he may have been, we don't know. We don't know much about Ambrosius at all. But what does seem clear from Gildas is that he masterminded the defense of some of the British areas against Saxon incursions at the middle of the end of the 5th century. And allegedly, therefore, he is the one that drives the Saxons back. And we know that in the early part of the 6th century, there were actually Saxons leaving Britain and going back to other parts of the empire because it was getting too hot for them. And certainly the number of Saxons coming in appears to slow in the early 6th century, maybe up to the middle of the century. Now, what happens after that? Because within 50 or so years, a lot of Britain is going to be controlled by Saxons. So the question then is, okay, well, if the Saxons are pushed back, which seems pretty likely from what we can see in archaeology and from Gildas and so on, what happens? What happens next? Well, what happens next is what Gildas is talking about. He's saying, come on, guys, you wake up. We're being overrun. There are more Saxons coming. And he is writing in the middle of the 6th century or thereabouts. So it's kind of what he's saying. He's saying, well, things ain't what they used to be. You're the heirs of Ambrosius and so on. You're the ones who should be defending the country. You're not doing a very good job. And he does talk about them squabbling amongst themselves. And so you get that impression that maybe the temporary unity of the war leader Ambrosius has, after his death, which must have been at the very latest at the end of the 5th century and could have been decades earlier, we're not sure. But the removal of that takes us back to the fragmented society along tribal lines where everybody's thinking, well, what's best for our lot, what's best for our lot, not what's best for. There is no Britain. There is no thing called Britain, which is a mistake people often make as well. There are areas of Britain.
Yeah, and hence they're digging ditches to divide up their own areas and saying, this is our land and that's your land to the different tribes.
Yeah, and what we find is that there are more Saxons coming in and that Saxons do begin to organise themselves, but we're not talking about your average Saxon in the street here. We're talking about the ruling Saxons. We're talking about the Saxons with power. the Saxon war leaders, basically. Now, one of the theories which I think, and these are all, obviously they're all theories, nobody can be absolutely certain how this happens in the 6th century, but what seems clear is that by the end of the 6th century, much of southern Britain and Midlands Britain has been taken over by Saxons. But we are not talking about population replacement. I mean, the DNA tells us enough of that. But what we're talking about is Saxon rulers. So we're not talking about a displacement of all Britons or death of the other Britons and replacement by Saxons. We're talking about replacement of authority. So Saxon war leaders with a war band of, I don't know, 40 to 100 warriors, maybe, could exert influence and take control of an area. But their aim is not to exterminate Britons. They're going to marry some of them. They're going to employ some of them. They're going to trust some of them. But they will have control. And if you've got a Saxon in control, that means Saxon customs rule, Saxon law rules, and all the rest of Saxon religion, which is a big issue, of course, because Roman Britain was a Christian society, and the Saxons are bringing paganism in. So there's a division point there. So that for me, that's what happens in the latter part of the 6th century. More Saxons exerting control, and once that Saxon's in control of, let's say, the area of Hampshire down to the coast, they've got a power base then. And if you live there, if you're a Briton in that area, you're not really talking about should I rebel against this, because he's the guy in charge, so you're going to fight for him. So it's far more complex than a simple wipe out the Britons, take their land. It's not. I don't see it that way anyway, and I don't think that that's the message that we're getting from archaeology. And the fact that there are more Britons surviving in the West reflects a couple of things, like it's further for the Saxons to spread their influence. Why, if you're a Saxon war leader in Hampshire, what reason would you have for trying to extend your boundaries? Because you may overextend those boundaries. So, it's not inevitable that they're trying to. This is not a swift thing. The growth of Wessex westwards and northwards and so on. It takes place over generations. But the initial shift from a Britain where Britons are mainly in control to a Britain where Saxons are mainly in control, it seems to me happens in the second half of the 6th century. So if you compare the beginning of the 5th with the end of the 6th, that's 200 years. It's a long time. They're very different places. Definitely. They're very different places. Beginning of the 5th, you have Roman authority. At the end of the 6th, you very much have English authority, Saxon authority in much of the country. Not all, but much.
So now on to the question that actually this is the $64,000 question. This is the question everybody wants to know. Where does King Arthur come into it all? And was he real?
Well, let's put aside all the rumours and say there was an Arthur. Whether he was king or not, let's say there was a person called Arthur in the late 5th, early 6th century, something like that. Let's say he existed. The worst thing that could have happened for him is Thomas Mallory. The worst thing that could have happened for him is that this massive series of legends arose around that name. Because what it's done is totally muddy the waters. Now it's almost impossible to separate fact from fiction, because everybody knows about King Arthur, but nobody knows about Arthur, if you see what I mean. The big thing about Arthur, and the reason why people for so long said he was a myth, a legend, was that Gildas, our prime literary source, doesn't mention Arthur at all. And he is talking about the period that Arthur would have lived in, and yet he's not mentioned at all. So there's this huge black hole in the writing of Gildas. And so what people have said is, well, Gildas doesn't mention him. He didn't exist. He can't have existed, because if he was that important in what was going on, Gildas would have to have mentioned him, surely. He mentions Ambrosius a lot. Ambrosius is his hero. Gildas is hero. So why doesn't he mention Arthur if Arthur existed? If Gildas doesn't mention him, he can't have existed. Okay, big news. Gildas mentions hardly anybody by name.
Yeah.
Ambrosius is the exception to the rule for Gildas. You could count on the fingers of two hands the
Right.
people Gildas mentions by name, and most of them aren't Britons anyway. So the fact that Gildas doesn't mention Arthur is not proof that he didn't exist. It's not helpful, for sure. Because the other thing is, if Gildas had mentioned Arthur, he would be a fact as far as historical
Yes.
life is concerned. But the fact that he doesn't mention doesn't mean it's not a deal breaker. It doesn't mean he didn't exist. Gildas puts the emphasis very much on Ambrosius Aurelianus. But the problem is the chronology of the whole thing, that the timelines don't really align that well. Nobody's terribly sure, because Gildas is a little bit confusing about this. We don't really know exactly when Gildas is writing. And because we don't know exactly when he's writing, we're not too sure which generation he's talking about. Is he writing, when he talks about Ambrosius Aurelianus, is he writing about a person who was prominent in the middle of the 5th century or the end of the 5th century, or a bit of both? We don't know. So if he's talking about a period maybe in, let's say, for argument's sake, 460s, 470s, 480s, then he's only actually telling us half a story, because it's clear that the success of Britain's limiting Saxon advances continues to the end of the century at least. So if Ambrosius wasn't around at the very end of the century, who was? Who was it who was fighting the Saxons if it wasn't Ambrosius? Gildas says it's Ambrosius, but how long does somebody have? What sort of fighting years does any man have? Unless he was fighting when he was 80, which is possible. It's possible. William Marshall probably was, but
Yeah.
do you see what I mean? The chronology is not clear, and if the chronology is not clear, then it's not clear when exactly Ambrosius was in control. And Gildas says he was the war leader. He united the Britons, which in itself is not necessarily the case, but roughly. But what happens after Ambrosius, and this whole thing about the battles and the Battle of Baden Hill and Mount Baden, which is mentioned in other sources later and credited to Arthur. Really, the search for Arthur is, how do we make sense of a world in which Arthur existed in that period? I don't think there's any doubt that the Welsh references to Arthur put him squarely in that period. I don't think there's any other period he's in.
So is there a possibility that Ambrosius is Arthur? Sometimes one person has 3 different names based on what language somebody's writing their information in.
The thing is, what we perhaps call the peripheral sources, genealogies, poetry, the Welsh annals, and so on, they do distinguish between Ambrosius and Arthur. So the mentions are so few and so garbled that you can't, hang your hat on them. It's just not enough. And that's why, if they were enough, then we wouldn't be even asking the question. But they're not. And so it's always hints and it's brief references. And you think, well, what does that mean? So I think in my own mind, I think there was definitely somebody called Ambrosius Aurelianus. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Had Gildas mentioned Arthur, then we'd all be saying there was definitely somebody called Arthur. I think there probably was somebody called Arthur, and I think he probably did lead the Britons. I mean, that's what the Welsh legends and so on will tell us. whether he was responsible, as Ambrosius was, for continuing Ambrosius' work, if you like, for driving, keeping the Saxons back, limiting their expansion. I don't know. You can't say, but it's a possibility, and it's more of a possibility if you strip aside the Arthurian legends, which, as I say, if you go to my neck of the woods and a bit further north, I mean, it's hard to, you trip over places called Arthur's Seat, Arthur's Hill, Arthur's this, Arthur's that. And you've got Glastonbury, which is associated with Arthur and so on. This is all medieval myth and legend. It's all medieval smoke and mirrors. But it doesn't mean that there wasn't an Arthur. I think that's where I stand at the moment, is that there is in a genealogy that mentions people that we know from other sources existed. If Arthur is in there, which he is, then why do we not believe he existed? Yes, we haven't got the same corroborating evidence as we might have for the other people in that genealogy, but if he's mentioned in the same breath as people who existed, why would you just suddenly lob in a name of somebody who didn't exist into the genealogy? It doesn't make any sense. So that's where we are. And I'm sure the argument will go on for sort of forever. I can't see us discovering anything. I think it's highly unlikely we'll discover anything concrete which says, yeah, there was definitely an Arthur.
Yeah. I think the thing is, we want there to be an Arthur.
Yeah.
As much as anything.
Well, I don't know that I do, actually. I don't really want anything to happen historically. I'd like to just know. For me, that's what matters, knowing whether something was the case or not. So it's not kind of hope on my part. I know it is for many. Well, of course, Arthur, the legend says that, the once and future king, doesn't it, Arthur? He'll always be there, coming back to help us in our time of need.
And he hasn't done it so far. He didn't come back during the Armada, although we managed that. He didn't come back in the First World War. He didn't come back in the Second World War. And I do have to question how effective he'd be, possibly on a horse with 5th century armor against the weapons we have today.
Yeah. I mean, as we learn more about the 5th and 6th centuries, I'm more eager to strip away all the legend and try and say, okay, well, can we piece together a situation in which Arthur was around, was exerting influence, and justifiably, therefore, has a reputation in the Welsh annals and so on, rather than trying to project the Arthur of legend back into this period and insert him in some way. There either was an Arthur in the late 5th century or there wasn't. I don't think he's based on Ambrosius, because Ambrosius was not a Briton, as far as we know. Again, can argue that forever. He may have come from British stock and Roman stock. His family, Roman family, was highly regarded in the empire. You can move around the 3 pieces of information we've got without getting very far. But I don't think that Arthur is Ambrosius. I don't think they're one and the same. To me, that doesn't really work. They talk about Arthur as a Briton, not as a Romano Briton or a Roman. And it kind of would be odd for that to be untrue. Unless we discover some secret history that was written in the 5th or 6th century.
That'd be lovely.
Yes, unlikely, I think.
Just one that clarified everything and didn't talk about the weather.
Yes, that would be good. Something that didn't talk about the weather would be great. And well, yeah, maybe the weather bits are the bits that are right.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Well, thanks, Derek. That's been fascinating. If you haven't read them yet, I do recommend getting hold of Derek's Last of the Roman series and reading them ahead of the new book coming out later this year.
Yeah, there's 3 books and a novella.
Yeah, they're a fascinating read, really enjoyable.
Ambrosius and Arthur are in there.
Yes. Do join us next time when we will be joined by Oh, Nathan Amin to talk about Owen Glendower. So we're going to Welsh history and Glendower's rebellion against Henry IV. I'm looking forward to that. I don't know much about him, so that's going to be interesting.
No, it'd be interesting. Yeah, it'd be good.
And Nathan knows his stuff, so that should be fascinating. Do join us. Thank you very much for listening. I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Don't forget, you can find us on your favourite podcast provider and also on our YouTube channel. Just search on A Slice of Medieval. Thanks for listening.